The highway was eerily quiet that night. Snowflakes drifted lazily under the amber glow of the streetlights, their slow descent almost peaceful, if not for the wreckage that lay ahead. Sergeant Jake Sullivan, a seasoned patrol officer with over a decade of experience on Montana's I-90, had seen his fair share of accidents. But as his headlights illuminated the crumpled remains of an overturned SUV, something about this one sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the freezing wind. Pulling onto the shoulder, he killed the sirens but left the emergency lights flashing, their red and blue pulses casting an eerie glow over the snow-covered asphalt. His radio crackled as he reported in. "Dispatch, this is Unit 14. Major accident at mile marker 237. Vehicle rollover. Stand by for victim assessment." The response was immediate, but Jake had already unbuckled and was stepping out into the bitter cold. His boots crunched against the icy road as he approached the wreck. The SUV lay on its side, its windshield shattered, steam rising from what was left of the hood. The front end had crumpled against the guardrail, metal twisted like paper. Jake's heart pounded as he scanned the interior with his flashlight, his breath fogging in the frigid air. No movement, no signs of life. Then, just barely audible over the howling wind, he heard it. A sound so faint he almost thought he imagined it. A whimper. Instinct kicked in, and he swept the beam of his flashlight across the wreckage. It came again, this time from beyond the vehicle, down the embankment. He moved quickly, boots slipping slightly on the frozen slope as he descended toward the noise. That's when he saw it. A dog. Half buried in the snow, a thick-furred shepherd mix lay curled around something small. Its body trembled, but not from the cold. Jake recognized fear when he saw it. As he stepped closer, the dog lifted its head, ears pinned back, eyes locking onto him with a mixture of wariness and defiance. Then he saw what the animal was guarding, a tiny hand. Jake's pulse kicked up as he dropped to one knee, his flashlight revealing a little girl, no older than 7, nestled against the dog's side. Her face was pale, her lips tinged blue, but she was breathing. And she wasn't alone. Somehow, through the chaos of the crash, this dog, this stray, if the lack of a collar was anything to go by, had positioned itself around her, shielding her from the worst of the cold. The realization hit him hard. Without the dog's body heat, without its protective presence, the girl wouldn't have lasted much longer in these temperatures. Carefully, Jake reached out. "Hey, buddy," he murmured, keeping his voice calm, reassuring. The dog didn't move. It didn't growl, didn't bare its teeth, but its muscles were taut, ready to bolt or fight if he got too close. Jake understood. It wasn't fear for itself, it was protecting her. He had seen loyalty before in the canine units he had worked alongside. But this was something different. This wasn't a trained service animal following commands. This was raw instinct, something deeper than training. This was love. A sharp gust of wind howled through the trees, cutting through Jake's uniform like a blade. Time was running out. He reached for his radio. "Dispatch, I've got a child down the embankment, conscious but unresponsive. I need EMS on scene now." The dog let out a low, uncertain whine as Jake leaned in closer. "I need to take her now," he said, more to the animal than himself. He wasn't sure why he was talking to it like a person, but somehow it felt right. "You did good. You kept her safe, but I have to get her out of here." A long pause. Then, as if understanding, the dog shifted, just enough for Jake to slide his arms beneath the little girl's fragile body. The moment she left its warmth, the dog let out a sharp, distressed bark and scrambled to its feet, ears pricked forward, ready to follow. Jake didn't stop it. Struggling against the weight of the child and the slick, icy incline, he climbed back up the embankment, the dog right beside him, never straying more than a foot away. It stayed close as he placed the girl in the warmth of his patrol car, as he wrapped her in the emergency blanket he always kept in the trunk. It was only when he heard the distant wail of approaching sirens that he allowed himself to breathe. The girl stirred slightly, murmuring something incoherent, and Jake exhaled a quiet prayer of relief. As the paramedics arrived, rushing to assess the child, Jake turned back to the dog. It stood a few feet away, watching, ears flicking forward and back as if trying to decide whether to stay or run. "You're not just some stray, are you?" Jake said softly. The dog blinked, its tail twitching once. It had saved a life tonight. Protected someone who couldn't protect herself. Jake wasn't sure what made him say it, but the words came out before he could stop them. "You coming with me, buddy?" The dog hesitated. Then slowly, it stepped forward. Not much, but enough. And in that moment, Jake knew. This wasn't the end of the story. This was just the beginning. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beep of the heart monitor. The little girl lay tucked beneath thick blankets, her small hands barely visible against the crisp white sheets. The doctor said she would be fine. Mild hypothermia, a few bruises, but nothing permanent. The real miracle, they all agreed, was how she had survived the crash and the freezing cold. Jake stood by the door, arms crossed, watching as the girl's mother clutched her daughter's hand, eyes glistening with relief. Nurses moved quietly around them, checking vitals, murmuring reassurances. But Jake's attention drifted beyond the room, beyond the warmth and the relief, to the cold night outside, where a different kind of survivor was waiting. Shadow. The dog had followed the ambulance to the hospital, padding silently behind Jake's patrol car. He hadn't tried to stop it. Something about the way it moved, never too close, never too far, made it clear it had made its choice. But now, with the girl safe and surrounded by her family, there was no reason for it to stay. Jake stepped outside, shoving his hands into his pockets as he scanned the parking lot. There, under the dim glow of a street lamp, sat Shadow. Snowflakes clung to its thick fur, its ears flicking as the cold wind blew through the lot. It didn't run when Jake approached, but it didn't move toward him either. "You still here, huh?" Jake muttered. Shadow blinked, its tail giving the smallest twitch. Jake crouched down, studying the dog. It was lean but not malnourished, its coat thick and well-adapted to the brutal Montana winters. No collar, no tags, no sign it had ever belonged to anyone. And yet, it had known exactly what to do last night. It had stayed with that little girl, protected her, kept her warm when she might have otherwise been lost to the cold. He had seen stray dogs before. They usually had a certain wildness to them, a skittishness born from too many close calls and too little kindness. But Shadow wasn't like that. There was a stillness in the way it watched him, an intelligence that ran deeper than mere survival. "Do you have a home?" Jake asked, knowing full well he wouldn't get an answer. The dog tilted its head, just slightly. The hospital doors hissed open behind him. Jake turned to see the girl's mother stepping out, her coat pulled tightly around her. She hesitated when she saw him, then smiled weakly. "Sergeant Sullivan," she said, her voice still thick with emotion. "I never got a chance to thank you." Jake shook his head. "You don't have to." She glanced past him, her eyes landing on Shadow. The smile faltered. "That dog. It was with her the whole time, wasn't it?" Jake nodded. Her fingers tightened on the edge of her coat. "We don't own a dog," she admitted. "I don't know where it came from. A few weeks ago, she started talking about a dog she'd see near the playground, always watching her. I thought she was imagining things." Jake looked back at Shadow. The dog held his gaze, calm, waiting. The woman exhaled. "She asked if we could keep it, but we're renting. No pets allowed." A flicker of guilt passed across her face. "Now, after everything, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Jake told her. Looks like the dog made its own decision. She hesitated a moment longer, then gave a small nod. If you find out where it came from, will you let us know? Yeah, Jake lied, because something in his gut told him that wasn't going to happen. She thanked him again before disappearing back into the warmth of the hospital, leaving Jake alone with Shadow once more. So, Jake said, standing up and brushing the snow off his knees. Guess that means you really don't belong to anyone, huh? The wind howled through the parking lot. The dog didn't move. Jake sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He wasn't in the habit of taking in strays. His job wasn't exactly conducive to pet ownership, and he barely spent enough time at home to justify keeping a plant alive, let alone a dog. And yet, as he looked at the animal sitting patiently in the snow, he knew there was no leaving it here. All right, he muttered, shaking his head. Let's go. He opened the passenger door of his patrol car, and for a second, Shadow didn't move. Then, as if deciding, it stood, trotted forward, and leapt into the seat with effortless grace. It sat there, quiet, watching Jake as if waiting for instructions. Jake slid behind the wheel and stared at the dog. You're gonna make my life real complicated, aren't you? Shadow blinked once, slow and deliberate. Jake sighed, put the car in drive, and pulled onto the highway. At the next red light, he glanced at the dog again. You need a name? Silence. He smirked. Shadow, that work for you? The dog didn't react at first. Then, as if considering, its tail gave the faintest, almost imperceptible wag. Shadow it is. And with that, the patrol car disappeared into the Montana night, carrying two travelers who, until now, had belonged to no one. The house was quiet when Jake pulled into his driveway, the snowfall already beginning to cover the tire tracks behind him. The soft glow of his porch light barely cut through the darkness as he shut off the engine. He sat there for a moment, hands still gripping the steering wheel, his thoughts heavy. The past 24 hours had been a whirlwind, an accident, a child saved, and now a stray dog sitting in his passenger seat like it had belonged there all along. Shadow had been silent the entire drive back, staring out the window with an intensity Jake had only ever seen in experienced canines, as if it was mapping out every turn, every shift in the road. It was unnerving in a way he couldn't quite place. There was something about this dog, something he couldn't shake. Not just the intelligence, not just the instincts. It was something deeper. Shadow wasn't just a stray. It had been waiting for something, for someone. And now, somehow, that someone was him. All right, buddy, Jake muttered, finally exhaling as he unbuckled his seatbelt. Let's see if you actually plan on staying. He opened the door, stepping out into the cold. Shadow didn't move at first, just flicked an ear in his direction. Then, with the kind of smooth, effortless grace that came from years of surviving on its own, the dog leapt out of the car and onto the snow-covered driveway. Jake unlocked the door and stepped inside, flipping on the lights. The space was simple, functional but not particularly welcoming. A couch, a modest kitchen, a TV mounted on the wall. It wasn't that he didn't care about making it feel like home. He just never saw the point when he spent more time at work than here. Shadow hesitated at the threshold, standing just outside the doorway, eyes scanning the unfamiliar space. Jake arched an eyebrow. You coming in, or do you just like hanging out in the snow? For the first time since he'd found it, Shadow hesitated. It wasn't fear, exactly, more like uncertainty, as if the concept of a warm home was something it had never quite considered before. Then, cautiously, it stepped inside. Jake shut the door behind them, watching as Shadow took slow, deliberate steps forward. The dog's nose twitched, ears flicking at every creak of the floorboards. It wasn't sniffing in the frantic way most dogs did when introduced to a new space. This was something else. It was assessing, cataloging, analyzing. You're really something, huh? Jake mused, shaking his head. Shadow ignored him, moving through the living room with the kind of quiet precision Jake had only seen in trained working dogs. It moved as if it was expecting something to happen at any moment, as if it had spent its entire life waiting for the next challenge, the next danger. Jake wasn't sure why, but it made him sad. With a sigh, he dropped his keys onto the counter and made his way to the spare bedroom. It wasn't much, just an old mattress and a pile of blankets he hadn't bothered to organize in months. He grabbed one and walked back into the living room, tossing it onto the floor. Shadow watched, unmoving. "There," Jake said. "Not exactly 5-star, but it'll do." Shadow looked at him, then at the blanket. Then, without hesitation, it turned, walked over to the couch, and leapt up onto it. Jake blinked. "Oh, so that's how it's gonna be?" The dog curled into a tight ball, tucking its tail around its body, eyes still open, still watching. Jake sighed. "Fine. But if you start thinking you run this place, we're gonna have a problem." Shadow didn't move. Jake shook his head, running a hand down his face before finally collapsing into his own chair. He should have been asleep by now, but there was something about having another presence in the house that kept him awake. He hadn't planned on keeping Shadow. He hadn't even planned on taking it home. But something about this dog made him pause. Something told him this wasn't just another stray. And the worst part? He had a feeling Shadow knew it too. The next morning, Jake woke up to the sound of claws clicking against the hardwood floor. He cracked one eye open, already regretting every decision he had made in the past 12 hours. Shadow was standing by the front door, ears perked, tail flicking once, twice. Jake groaned, rubbing his face. "You better not expect me to let you out every time you get bored." The dog didn't respond. Sighing, he swung his legs over the edge of the bed and stood up, stretching as he made his way to the door. He barely had it open before Shadow slipped past him, trotting out into the crisp morning air. Jake watched as the dog moved with purpose, scanning the tree line, nose lifting slightly as it caught something only it could smell. He'd seen that posture before, on search and rescue dogs, on canines trained for tracking. It was instinct. Pure, sharp, refined instinct. And that's when it hit him. This wasn't just a dog that had survived on its own. It wasn't just smart. It had been trained. Maybe not by professionals, maybe not officially, but somewhere along the way, Shadow had learned how to track, how to assess, how to move with purpose. Jake narrowed his eyes. "All right, buddy," he murmured. "Who the hell were you before all this?" Shadow didn't answer, of course, but as it turned back to him, those sharp amber eyes locking onto his, Jake felt something shift. Maybe he wasn't just helping this dog. Maybe, just maybe, it was here to help him too. Training Shadow wasn't easy. It was stubborn, fiercely independent, and too smart for its own good. But Jake had worked with canines before. He knew how to break through that wall. At first it resisted commands, ignoring him whenever he tried to enforce discipline. It didn't respond to food, didn't respond to praise. It wasn't being disobedient. It simply didn't care about rewards. What it cared about was purpose. The first time Jake realized it was during a simple tracking exercise. He had set up a basic trail, nothing complicated, just something to test Shadow's ability. And while most dogs would have followed the scent in a straightforward path, Shadow didn't. It stopped. It recalculated. And then, instead of following the obvious trail, it cut ahead, predicting the end destination rather than mindlessly following the scent. Jake had never seen anything like it. Over the next few weeks, he tested Shadow again and again, pushing it harder, refining its skills. The dog wasn't just good, it was exceptional, faster, smarter, more adaptable than any canine he had ever worked with. And then came the real test, a missing person case. Jake hadn't planned on using Shadow in the field. It wasn't official. It wasn't trained through the department. But when a young boy went missing in the nearby woods, and every other tracking dog failed to pick up the trail, Jake took a chance, and Shadow delivered. It didn't just find the scent, it anticipated the boy's path. It didn't stop at obstacles, it worked around them. And when Jake finally saw the child, curled beneath the roots of a fallen tree, shaking and terrified, it wasn't Jake who reached him first. It was Shadow. That night, as Jake sat on his porch watching Shadow curl up at his feet, he realized something. This dog wasn't meant to be someone's pet. It was meant to be a hero. Shadow was no ordinary dog. That much had become clear to Jake in the weeks that followed the missing person case. The way it moved, the way it thought, the way it anticipated rather than simply reacted. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, even among the best K9s on the force. But that didn't mean it was going to be easy. Jake knew from experience that training a police dog wasn't just about teaching commands. It was about trust, discipline, and most of all, a bond strong enough to withstand any danger. Shadow had the instincts, the intelligence, and the raw ability, but it also had something else. A wildness, a defiance that came from years of surviving on its own. Shadow didn't just obey, it had to choose to follow. And that made it both the most frustrating and the most promising partner Jake had ever worked with. That first real mission was the moment everything changed. The call came in just after sunset. A robbery gone wrong. 2 suspects had fled a high-end jewelry store, their car abandoned outside a small industrial district on the outskirts of town. No witnesses, no surveillance footage clear enough to confirm their identities. They had vanished into the maze of warehouses and shipping containers, and night was closing in fast. Jake was still a patrol officer. Technically, Shadow wasn't even on the force yet, but when he arrived at the scene and saw the other K9 teams struggling to pick up a trail, he knew. This was it. Shadow sat beside him, ears flicking, nose twitching, as it took in the scattered scents around them. It was waiting. Jake knelt beside it, lowering his voice. "Find them." No hesitation. Shadow bolted forward, weaving through the rows of buildings with a precision that sent chills down Jake's spine. It wasn't just following a scent, it was tracking, analyzing, adjusting its path in real time. It cut corners, doubled back when necessary, and Jake realized with a start that Shadow wasn't just following where the suspects had been, it was predicting where they were going. Jake's breath came faster as he followed, boots crunching against the gravel. The other officers were fanning out, methodically clearing buildings one by one, but Shadow wasn't wasting time on that. It moved with absolute certainty, leading Jake through a narrow alley, past rusting machinery until... a noise. A sharp breath. Shadow stopped cold, muscles tense, its entire body locked onto something in the shadows. Jake barely had time to react before one of the suspects moved. It happened fast. Too fast. The man lunged from his hiding place, a desperate attempt to break free. But before Jake could even reach for his gun, Shadow was there. A blur of motion, a snarl that echoed through the empty lot. And then the suspect was down. Shadow had him pinned, teeth bared but controlled, a deep growl rumbling in its throat as it held the man in place. No panic, no hesitation, just precision. Jake moved in, securing the suspect with cuffs before turning to Shadow. "Release." Shadow hesitated, just for a second. And then, as if remembering, it stepped back, letting Jake take over. The second suspect was found minutes later, trying to slip through an open gate. He didn't get far, not with Shadow leading the charge. By the time backup arrived, the case was over. 2 arrests, no injuries, and a dog that had just proven itself to be one of the most valuable assets on the force. The department was skeptical at first. Shadow wasn't an official K9. It hadn't gone through the traditional training program, hadn't followed the standard protocol. It was an unknown factor, and in law enforcement, unknowns were dangerous. But the reports spoke for themselves. 2 suspects apprehended in record time. a tracking ability that outperformed every other canine in the unit, and most importantly, a handler-dog bond that had already saved lives. So they made an exception. Shadow was officially brought into the program, assigned to Jake full-time. The training intensified. Obedience drills, tactical maneuvers, high-stress simulations. Every step of the way, Shadow adapted faster than any dog they had ever seen. But it wasn't just skill that made Shadow different. It was something deeper, a sense of purpose. Most canines followed orders because they were trained to. Shadow followed because it wanted to, because it understood the mission, because it had chosen Jake just as much as Jake had chosen it, and that made all the difference. Their second major case was nothing like the first. No chase, no pursuit, just a missing child and a clock that was running out. It was a cold December evening when the call came in. A 6-year-old boy had wandered away from his home in the mountains, the kind of wilderness where temperatures dropped below freezing and survival depended on luck. By the time Jake and Shadow arrived, search teams had already combed the area for hours. No footprints, no leads, just a desperate family and a sinking feeling in Jake's gut. He knelt beside Shadow, running a hand down the dog's thick fur. "Find him." Shadow lifted its head, nose to the wind, and then it moved. Jake followed, heart pounding as Shadow led them off the main search grid, away from the areas the other teams had covered. It wasn't guessing. It wasn't aimless. It was reading something no human could see. The minutes stretched on, then an hour, then 2. The cold was biting, the wind howling through the trees, and then a bark. Not aggressive, not alert, just urgent. Jake ran. His flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the shape of a small figure curled beneath a fallen tree. The boy was barely conscious, his little body trembling from the cold. And Shadow. Shadow was lying next to him, pressing close, sharing its body heat, just like it had done for that little girl the night Jake found it. Jake swallowed hard, his throat tightening. "Good dog," he whispered. They got the boy out in time. Another few hours, and it would have been too late. And as the child's mother sobbed into his shoulder, thanking him over and over, Jake knew the truth. He hadn't been the one who saved her son. Shadow had. That night, as Jake sat in his truck, watching the snowfall outside, Shadow curled up in the passenger seat, tail flicking in its sleep. "You're not just a dog," Jake murmured. "You're a damn miracle." Shadow's ear twitched. Jake smiled. It had been a long road to get here, and it was far from over. But now, there was no doubt. Shadow wasn't just a stray anymore. It was exactly where it was meant to be. The storm came without warning. Jake had seen winter hit Montana hard before, but nothing like this. One moment the sky was clear, the cold biting, but manageable. The next, the wind howled through the mountains, turning the world into a blur of white. Snow fell thick and fast, swallowing the landscape in a suffocating silence. The radio chatter had already been tense, reports of a multi-vehicle pileup on the highway, drivers stranded, emergency services stretched thin. But it was the second call that sent a chill through Jake that had nothing to do with the weather. A truck had gone off the road, slid straight down a steep embankment, vanishing into the trees. No word from the driver. No way to tell if he was alive. Jake didn't hesitate. He and Shadow had faced worse before. The roads were nearly impassable by the time they reached the crash site. Emergency lights cast a ghostly red and blue glow against the endless white. Officers struggling to keep warm as they coordinated search efforts. The truck's tracks were barely visible, half buried in fresh snow. The fall had been steep, and from up here, it was impossible to see where the vehicle had landed. Jake stepped out of the patrol car, bracing against the wind as Shadow leapt down beside him. Snow clung to the dog's thick coat, but its ears were up, body taut. It knew something was wrong. Jake turned to the nearest officer. "How long since impact?" "About an hour," the man shouted over the wind. No response on the radio. No movement down there. Jake nodded, his gaze following the trail of broken branches leading into the darkness below. Then he knelt beside Shadow, brushing snow from its fur. Find him. Shadow didn't hesitate. Jake followed, his boots sinking deep with every step as they moved down the embankment. The slope was treacherous, ice hidden beneath fresh powder, every step a risk. Shadow, built for this kind of terrain, moved effortlessly ahead, weaving between trees, nose to the ground, eyes sharp, minutes stretched into eternity. Then, Shadow stopped. A low, urgent bark. Jake moved faster, heart pounding, and then he saw it. The truck was a wreck of twisted metal, its front half buried in snow, windshield shattered. And inside, slumped against the steering wheel, was the driver. Jake scrambled forward, pressing his fingers against the man's neck. Pulse, weak, but there. "Hey!" Jake called, shaking his shoulder. No response. The cold was setting in, fast. Jake grabbed his radio. "I found him! He's alive, but unresponsive. I need paramedics down here now." Static. Then a crackling voice. "Roads are blocked. Storm's getting worse. You're on your own for now." Jake's stomach clenched. He turned back to Shadow, who stood by the wreck, ears flicking, waiting for the next command. The paramedics weren't coming. If they didn't move now, the man wouldn't make it. Jake turned back to the driver. He was a big guy, unconscious and dead weight. There was no way Jake could carry him up the embankment alone. He needed help. He needed Shadow. Jake grabbed one of the man's arms, looping it around his shoulders as he looked at Shadow. "I need you to lead the way." Shadow's ears twitched, as if understanding. Jake adjusted his grip and started moving. It was slow, agonizingly slow. The man's weight dragged at him, his muscles burning with effort. The snow fought against every step, the wind cutting into his exposed skin. Shadow moved ahead, pausing every few feet, looking back, making sure Jake was still following. Halfway up, Jake's foot slipped. The world tilted. For one heart-stopping second, he felt himself falling, the weight of the man pulling him down. Then, something stopped him. Shadow. The dog had lunged, its teeth sinking into Jake's sleeve, pulling with everything it had. Not enough to hurt, just enough to keep him steady. Jake's breath came fast, his heart hammering, but he nodded. Good dog. Shadow let go, stepping back, waiting. Jake pushed forward. Step by step they climbed. By the time they reached the top, Jake could barely feel his hands. His arms shook, his vision blurred with exhaustion. But they had made it. Officers rushed forward, taking the driver from him, wrapping him in blankets, checking vitals. Jake stumbled back, chest heaving. And then he felt a weight against his side. Shadow. The dog leaned against him, solid and steady. Jake let out a breathless laugh, running a hand through Shadow's fur. "You really saved my ass, buddy." Shadow blinked up at him. Then, for the first time since Jake had met him, the dog wagged its tail. Jake's throat tightened. A siren wailed in the distance. Paramedics were finally arriving. But it didn't matter. Shadow had already done what no one else could. That night, back home, Jake sat on the floor with Shadow curled beside him. The fire crackled in the hearth, warmth finally seeping into his frozen bones. Shadow was asleep, its breathing slow and steady. Jake stared down at it, something heavy settling in his chest. This wasn't just a dog. This wasn't just a partner. This was family. He reached out, running his fingers through Shadow's thick coat. "You're not going anywhere, are you?" he murmured. Shadow didn't wake. Didn't need to. Because they both already knew the answer. The years passed in a blur of sirens and searchlights, of late-night calls and cold, unforgiving roads. Every shift brought a new challenge, a new case, a new moment where the difference between life and death came down to instinct, training, and trust. And through it all, through every mission, every chase, every desperate race against time, Shadow was there. It had long since stopped being just a dog, just a canine unit, just a partner. Shadow was a part of Jake, as much a part of his team as any human officer. It was there when they tracked fugitives across frozen rivers, when they uncovered evidence buried deep in the underbelly of the city, when they pulled lost hikers from the jaws of an unrelenting winter. It never hesitated, never faltered, never questioned. And neither did Jake. Their reputation grew. Shadow wasn't just another police dog, it was a legend. Departments across the state requested its assistance in missing person cases, in high-risk operations where only the best could be trusted. News outlets covered its heroic rescues, stories of people found just in time, of criminals caught when every lead had gone cold. Civilians stopped Jake on the street to thank him, to pet the dog that had saved their neighbor, their child, their friend, and every time Jake would smile, give Shadow a pat, and say, "I just follow the lead. It's Shadow who does the real work." But heroes don't last forever. Jake noticed the changes slowly at first. A little more stiffness in Shadow's stride after a long chase, a little more hesitation before jumping into the truck. A little less energy at the end of a shift. It was still strong, still sharp, still brilliant. But time had a way of catching up with even the greatest. The moment that truly hit Jake, the moment he knew things were different, came on a quiet afternoon at the training grounds. They had been going through drills just like always. Commands, tracking exercises, endurance runs. But that day, for the first time in all the years they had worked together, Shadow hesitated. Just for a second. Just long enough for Jake to see it. The weight of time pressing down on the dog that had once seemed unstoppable. It wasn't fear. It wasn't weakness. It was something else. A quiet understanding, a knowing look in those sharp amber eyes. Jake knelt beside it, pressing a hand to its side, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of its breathing. "You tired, buddy?" Shadow didn't answer, of course, but it didn't need to. The decision wasn't easy. It never would be. But Jake knew it was time. Shadow had given everything, more than any dog, any officer, any partner ever could. It had earned the right to rest. The retirement ceremony was small, just close colleagues and the people whose lives Shadow had changed. Officers from across the state came to pay their respects, to honor the dog that had done what no human could. Medals were placed around its neck, words were spoken, and for the first time in years, Shadow sat beside Jake without a badge, without a mission, without a command waiting to be given. But it was happy. And that was enough. The next years were slower, quieter. Walks instead of sprints. Warm afternoons in the backyard instead of cold nights in the field. And through it all, Jake stayed by its side, just as Shadow had stayed by his. And then, one night, the silence came. It wasn't dramatic. There was no final mission, no last heroic act, just a peaceful evening, the fireplace crackling, the world outside quiet and still. Shadow lay beside Jake, its breathing deep and steady, and then, just like that, it stopped. Jake didn't cry. Not right away. He just sat there, his hand resting gently on Shadow's fur, his mind replaying every moment, every chase, every impossible rescue, every time he had turned to find those amber eyes watching him, waiting, trusting. The funeral was held at the department. Officers lined the walls, K-9 handlers from across the state standing shoulder to shoulder. Words were spoken, stories told. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Jake didn't speak at first. He wasn't sure he could. But as he looked out over the crowd, over the faces of the people whose lives had been touched by Shadow, he knew he had to. He stepped forward, clearing his throat. Some dogs are born for a purpose. Some are trained for it. And then there are the rare few that choose it for themselves. Shadow wasn't just a police dog. It wasn't just a partner. It was my friend. It was my family. And it never once hesitated to do the right thing, no matter the cost. His voice caught just for a second. He exhaled, looking down at the badge that now sat in a glass case beside Shadow's collar. "If there's one thing Shadow taught me," he continued, quieter now, "it's that loyalty isn't something you train. It's something you give. Trust isn't something you demand. It's something you earn. And love, real love, doesn't need words." He looked down at the collar in his hands, running a thumb over the worn leather. "Shadow gave me all of that. Every single day." He looked up, meeting the eyes of every person in the room. "And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to live up to that." The silence that followed was heavier than words. In the years that followed, Shadow's story never faded. New officers came, new dogs were trained, but its legacy remained. A scholarship was founded in its name, funding the training of shelter dogs for law enforcement work. A plaque was placed in the department, engraved with the words, "Some heroes have 4 legs and a heart bigger than the world." And Jake? He kept working, kept training, kept searching. But every now and then, late at night, when the station was quiet and the only sound was the hum of the radio, he could swear he still heard the soft jingle of a collar. And he would smile, because he knew. Some partnerships never really end. Shadow's story was never just about a dog and a cop. It was about something much bigger, something that resonates far beyond the confines of law enforcement or the adrenaline of high-stakes rescues. It was about loyalty, redemption, and the power of second chances. It was about how trust isn't given, it's earned, and how sometimes the most unexpected bonds are the ones that change us forever. Shadow wasn't supposed to be a hero. It was just a stray, a dog that had been abandoned, overlooked, written off as too wild, too broken. But it proved that greatness isn't about where you come from. It's about what you choose to become. Every time it ran into danger, every time it tracked the lost, every time it stood between harm and the innocent, it wasn't just following instincts. It was proving that every life, human or animal, deserves a chance to show its worth. For Jake, Shadow was more than a partner. It was family. It was a reminder that love doesn't always come in the way we expect, that sometimes the most profound connections don't need words. Shadow gave everything without hesitation, and in return, it taught Jake the most valuable lesson of all. The best things in life aren't the ones we seek, but the ones that find us when we need them most. In the end, Shadow's legacy wasn't just in the lives it saved. It was in the people it inspired, the proof that courage, loyalty, and trust can come from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the greatest heroes walk on 4 legs. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.